this was rattling around my head for a while. The way I see it, there's a difference between horror games and horror film. There's two problems with the horror genre in general. It's not a genre I like really much. I wouldn't endorse it that much. But there's two problems with it in general. And this goes probably for every media. The first genre is that it's... the first feature, the first negative point is that it's cheap. It's cheap because the entire genre is focused on basically just fear and, other derivatives of fear and, things associated with fear. It's not really interested in anything else. At least that's how it is for the most part. The second feature, the second category of bad, is that horror as a concept is intrinsically unappealing, I would say. It's intrinsically bad, simply because it's not enjoyable to watch. In fact, it's this weird psychological thing that people watch it because they want to see something that they won't enjoy. It's shock value is what it is. I mean, I don't know too much about the psychology of the genre and stuff. You'd have to take courses to learn about that stuff. I'm speaking about it in an artistic sense. There's unappealing stuff in the horror genre. There's violence a lot of the time. And it's not even just violence. It's bad, depressing, depraved, horrible stuff that you don't want to think about when you go throughout life. If a horror story happened in real life, you would be upset about it. You wouldn't want to think that something like that could happen. Well, I mean, that goes for the horror stories that are based in reality, I guess. Right? It's there's a certain word for it that I forget. Arshan Ghai talks about it a lot. It's like grittiness, but it's not just it's not called grittiness. It's called something else. I forget what it's called, but there's a word for it. Squick. That's the word. It's called squick. That's the stuff I'm talking about. That's what the horror genre is absolutely riddled with, is squick. It's unappealing stuff for the sake of being unappealing, and grittiness for the sake of, grit and realism, I guess. Now, I'm just going to say this right out here, right up front, is all of that stuff sucks. That stuff is simply not good. If you're trying to write a book or be an artist or do anything, that stuff is simply bad. All right? Why is it bad? Because it's unappealing. Because the whole point of it is to be unappealing. It's to go up to the viewer's face, the audience's face, and tell them, here's something you won't like, and enjoy it. Right? There's a negative value to that intrinsically, right? Of course there is. However, so why is... You might think of me a little strangely then, because obviously there's a lot of art that has squick, there's a lot of art that has violence and stories, and many of these stories I probably enjoy. Why do I enjoy them if I talk about violence as if it's such a bad thing, as if it's intrinsically evil? Because there's a criterion. It's evil, but there's a way to get around that by justifying it. Right, so here's the point, here's the idea, here's my model. If there's anything in art that's unappealing, that's violent or disgusting or meant to simply make you feel bad or in like a visual and deeply psychological sense, something make you feel uncomfortable, that stuff has to justify itself. It can't just be there for the sake of being there. It can't just be in the film, in the book, whatever, simply because we want it there, simply because, hey, this will be fun. No, there has to be another purpose to it. There has to be another layer to it, is what I'm saying. It can't just be face value type thing. There has to be another layer of character development to it, or another layer of plot development to it, or another layer of setting development to it, or another layer of thematic development. The story has to be intertwined with this evil, horrendous thing, so that it's not just an evil, horrendous thing, it's a necessary evil, right? We could look at it as a necessary evil. Like take Lord of the Rings, for instance, that's a story that has quite a bit of violence. But I would say that violence, even though it's not appealing, it's a necessary evil, because without it, the story simply wouldn't work, right? That's kind of the approach I take with this. So the point is that a lot of art, at least modern day art, a lot of what they do is this weird grit thing. Ever since like the Dark Knight, or hell, even since like ever since like the Bronze Age of comic books, they have started making gritty. The art has become very, very gritty, especially within film. You know, the whole purpose is to just make it, sort of realistic and dark and moody and stuff. And honestly, I feel like more often than not, that just comes across as cheap. It comes across as cheap because you're not really trying too hard. You're going for this gimmick. You're going for this very easy gimmick, and you're mistaking that for quality. It's not like it's like the Sin City gimmick. It's that sort of gritty style, but not really doing what a movie like that does well. It's instead just saying, "Oh, look at this! It's grit. Isn't that meaningful? Isn't that awesome? Isn't that, deep?" No, it's not. It's not deep unless you make it deep. Simply by making it gritty doesn't make it deep. Grittiness is a gimmick, like all these things, right? So let's get on to the actual matter of fact. What's the problem with horror movies? Now, in general, I'd say that horror movies are worse than horror games. In fact, I would say that more often than not, I can't stand horror movies, and I'd be perfectly fine if the genre didn't even exist. Horror games, on the other hand, net positive. Horror movie genre, net negative. Easy, simple as that. Why? Alright, well, there's a few reasons. I guess the first reason is that this whole grit thing has this, it has a very depressing quality. It's not enough. A horror movie isn't interested in just scaring you, because there's different ways to scare a person. Scaring a person can be fun. They're not interested in just that. They want to depress you, okay? They want to develop these characters and have you connect with them and then just ruin their lives. Because that's supposed to be scary, I guess? I mean, it's not scary to just ruin a character, right? Scariness is atmosphere. Scariness is in setting. Fear, it's all these things, and we can talk about it psychologically. Fear is lighting. Fear is sound, and so on and so forth. It's not violence, and it's not grit, and it's not whatever's happening on the screen. And it certainly isn't when your character just suffers and dies at the end, right? Like, okay, I guess the big thing is that here characters are supposed to fail. And honestly, that sucks, because it just means, like, the story just doesn't matter in that case, right? It just doesn't matter. I feel like I gain nothing from it if the whole point of it is to just end horribly. It's like you know the ending before it even starts. A lot of horror movies do this. They just have the character fail. Not all. Some actually try to have a continuity of sorts. Some actually sort of have a character survive and have the villain survive so that you can make a sequel, which is also bad because that's just exploitative. But the point is, it's better than just having characters fail, right? Sometimes one character will survive and a lot of other characters will fail. Okay, that's better, I guess, but it's still sort of the same premise. Characters are still supposed to fail. So no matter how much you develop them, it just becomes, it seems useless to me. It's not like you're trying to make a point. It's not like you're trying to have a theme or tell a story or tell a story, right? You're just, you know that some of these people will die and this will happen no matter what. And if they weren't going to die, then it wouldn't be scary, right? If there was no fear of death, there would be no fear. That's not necessarily true. Fear is an atmosphere. I mean, I think it would be amazing to see a movie that could scare people without actually having the characters suffer. That would be a feat. That would be a feat of writing if someone could manage to do that. But that would be really cool to see, right? Because it would be so different, right? And it's not like the way the fear even happens is interesting. It's just, in some ways, it's completely retarded. For instance, there's a movie I saw like a year or two ago called Frozen. And no, not the new Frozen, the Disney animated thing. No, there was another movie called Frozen, which was about 3 people that got stuck on a ski lift because the ski lift was turned off for somebody forgot that people were on the ski lift, and it was like the end of the day. They turn off the ski lift, and these people sit there up on the ski lift. They can't get down because they're retarded. And then one guy jumps down and he like breaks his leg, and then he gets eaten by wolves. And another guy comes down by like shimmying across the cable and going down a ladder, and then he gets eaten by wolves. And then the only one who survives is the girl, the staple female character, and she survives because the wolves weren't going to chase her because they were already eating the other 2 people. And it's just like, well, why the fuck did I watch this? I mean, okay, I can tell you why I watched it, and this isn't a very good instinct to have, but in general, the reason I'd be interested, damn, it's getting dark. The reason I would be interested in watching horror whatsoever, I have no way to describe it, but it's sort of the I can't look away mentality, the I can't look away paradigm, right? Because it's not about being interested in what's there, it's about seeing if I can take it. It's about being curious, like, wow, did they really have a movie about that? You know, it's like, it's the shock value. It's the same reason why people go on the internet and watch, like, Two Girls, One Cup, or crazy stuff that happens on the internet, right? You know, they do that just because they're curious, just because, can I take this? And I have some of that as well, and it's literally the only reason I'm ever interested in these horror movies. But afterwards, I don't feel good about it, right? Now, excuse me, I'm gonna actually turn on the light here because I chose a late time of day to make the video. Anyway, right. They make... What was I saying? It's about the shock value. For almost everyone, it's about the shock value. It's not even about the thrill as much as it is about the shock value. This movie, Frozen, was not thrilling at all. You know, and this is what the violence comes in for. The violence, you know, and the you know, for splatter films and slasher films, again, it's all shock value. It's not... Even if it's thrilling in a cheap way. So it's like, what is it even for? Right? And this is actually why slasher films and splatter films and all these films are just pure bad. Like pure 100% bad, net negative all the way around, no matter what you do. Because literally they have no goal other than to be unappealing. Okay, I don't even have to justify that. That is without a doubt true. Okay, take any of these films, you can say without a doubt that their goal is to be unappealing. Even if there's some weird philosophical message at the back there, it is just buried beneath heaps and heaps and heaps of bad, heaps and heaps and heaps of unappealing. So all that unappealingness does not justify itself by this standard, right? So just bad. I mean, that's splatter films. Horror films in general are more complex. You know, they're not just about being unappealing, but there's still a lot of that. They're about being depressing, on the other hand. And that's also not a good feeling to have. Like, it feels like I'm being tricked. Why don't I go and fall in love with this character that I see on screen and want to see what they do when I know that at the end they're just going to screw up? And it's not that they screw up, you know, in a plot sense either, you know, because the plot is always dumb. The plot doesn't make sense. The characters make stupid decisions. It's like, and they make stupid decisions because you're not supposed to feel bad for them. But then it's like, if you're not supposed to feel bad for them, why should you connect with them anyway? Like, you can't have it both ways, horror films. You can't try and get me to connect with the character, but at the same time tell me that I shouldn't connect with them by making them be retarded. It's like I'm supposed to connect to them only up to the point of wanting to see what they do, but not actually connecting with them up to the point of wanting to see them fulfill their story arc and succeed at something. No, it's just... It's this whole paradox of just the character is supposed to fail, but you're not supposed to love them, but you are kind of right. So that depressing quality should just it just shouldn't matter. The story is not a primary concern either. Like, the plots are not well developed. They're not really intricate. Usually they involve a very simple premise, a very, very simple... Wow, it's getting really dark. I might have to turn on the light in the room so I wouldn't get scared. Anyway, yeah, the premise is usually really stupid. You know, it's usually, oh, there's a serial killer who's trying to kill us and who's haunting our house. Oh, damn. And stuff like that. You know, if it's just some serial killer stuff, it's just bleh. Like, it just sucks. Because that's not a plot. That's like one fraction of a plot. And at the end... whatever happens in that fraction doesn't matter because it all ends the same way. It's just... The plot is not a concern. The characters are not a concern because their very development is paradoxical, right? And it's usually cheap. And it's usually just bad even if they try to make it good, right? Even if they try to develop the characters, it's usually... The characters' personalities are just what they have to be in order for them to do what they do and fail. So it's... So they're not even interesting characters, they're not even people, and it's depressing at the end of all that, right? It's just all these layers of stuff that's just isn't good. And fear, now I'm gonna say something, but fear is not necessarily bad. I don't think fear is inherently evil. The way unappealing stuff and squick is inherently evil. Stuff like violence is inherently evil. Fear, I don't think fear is inherently evil. Fear is probably actually inherently positive because that's the thrill that people are looking for, right? That's the thrill. But it's not thrilling, right? So if horror movies simply tried to scare you, and they tried to scare you in a purest form without trying to unappeal, that would actually be interesting. In fact, come to think about it, some of the scariest things I've seen in movies have been in movies that weren't really horror movies at all. They were just things that I didn't expect, or things that were very creepy even though they shouldn't have been, or things that were, things that were very sort of immaterial and creepy in like a Silent Hill sense, right? Without actually going for that depressing and depraved and squicky side of things. Whenever you venture into that territory, I think you're doing the wrong thing. I think you're going away from fear and trying to get into the mindset of, well, here's bad, and then here's more bad, and it's supposed to be part of the fun. And that's still appealing, but only because of the voyeuristic instinct that we all have to want to see unappealing, shocking things, like a Serbian film, and Human Centipede, which doesn't even deserve to be talked about if you ask me. So these are the problems with horror movies. And honestly, it's unfortunate because I don't watch too many horror movies, and maybe I miss the ones that are good. I mean, I certainly know that there's like Rob Zombie movies that have interesting visual instinct characteristics, and I've watched plenty of those, although they've still had problems and I still didn't like them. So I just feel like it would be a huge challenge and merit to the art if filmmakers tried to make a horror movie that wasn't unappealing. If they tried to make a horror movie that didn't have to resort to squick or depression or any of that stuff, they try fear in more subtle ways. And that's probably hard, damn near impossible to do. Unless you're making a video game. And that's kind of the point, right? So what are the merits? So what are the merits of horror games? Why is it that horror games are better? Okay, well, the simple answer to this is that, well, there's several nuances, but one is I feel that horror games can't fall into the same trap, because with movies, you basically don't even have to try to come up with a story to sell a horror movie, right? You have a premise, you don't have a movie, right? You don't need to have an intricate plot, you just have, okay, it's actually getting ridiculously dark. And turn on the lights. 1 second. There we go, that's better. All right. Right. So, the plot of a horror movie, it doesn't have to be intricate, it doesn't have to be developed, it doesn't have to be anything. The characters, they have to fill some small role, but not really that much. In a game, all of these things are way more complicated because it's a game, the player has to be 100% invested in the game for the game to even work, right? Because if the player's not invested, they just turn off the game and stop playing. With a movie, it's not the case. I feel like some people will watch movies even if they're not invested. That's actually kind of what movies have become. They've become a cheap thrill. They've just become a thing that you can kind of thrill yourself by getting into, but something you don't really have to invest yourself in order to enjoy. And that's what horror movies are. You don't have to invest yourself to enjoy them. They're just sort of cheap, and they have their jump scares every once in a while, and that's supposed to thrill you, but at the end of the day, you're not supposed to think about it. And I'm sorry, well, for me, I'm pretty sensitive in general, but I think about stuff a lot. So if I watch a terrible horror movie that was depressing, I'm going to think about how depressing it is later, and I'm just going to be depressed because I'm going to start trying to calculate and figure out, well, what could have the characters done to have gotten out of that, and what should they done differently, and maybe it's not so bad if it happened in real life, and all these, like, imaginative fantasies that I admit are completely ridiculous, but I do them anyway. Because that's the effect that these things have on me, because I don't want to be depressed, and this is how I get out of that, right? And most people probably don't get depressed when they watch these movies because they don't interpret them as anything serious. They don't invest themselves, right? I invest myself in art. That's sort of my thing, right? So that's why I don't have the luxury of doing that. But games are different, okay? A game requires investment from the audience by definition. If there's no investment, the person stops playing. That's how it works, okay? They don't continue watching till the end or playing till the end even if they're not invested anymore, right? They might do that for a movie because there's other reasons to watch movies, because maybe they think, it's a low effort type of thing, right? You could just keep watching a movie, maybe something will happen that you'll enjoy even if you're not enjoying it so far. Maybe, you're doing it with your friends and you just want to watch the movie with your friends. Maybe you just want to criticize it. With a game, you really have to weigh the odds. And if you're not enjoying the game at a certain point, you're going to realize, I'm not enjoying this. I don't want to take the chance that I might enjoy this at some point. I'm just going to stop. Because to keep going requires a lot more work than to just sit there looking at the screen. And because of that, people who make horror games have to try a lot harder to invest players. For one, the main character can't just fail, right? Because there's a failure state, but the character story can't just fail. Why? Because the story is about the character, and because you're playing the character, the story is about you. And you can't just fail, because then you feel the way I feel when I watch horror movies, and it's just like, I just wasted my time. This meant nothing. You can't have players feel like that, because then they're not going to like your game, right? You either have to lead them along and give them enough just to keep playing, or wrap them up in a story, or make it so that they actually accomplish something so that they leave the experience feeling good about themselves, or give them the idea that they can accomplish something, that there is a way that they can do something, because that's what keeps people going, okay? There's ways to get players invested in their games. Part of that is character development. Part of that is getting the player themselves invested in the story to the point where the player thinks that they can win and accomplish something within this fantasy gaming world, and you deliver upon that promise, and they actually accomplish something, and everybody wins, right? That's usually what happens. When that doesn't happen, people go away with it thinking the game is terrible. And by the way, horror games is a pretty restricted genre, because I'm not talking squick games. I'm not talking like, splatter games like, what was it called? It's a very old game, Hitman or something? No, it's not Hitman. It's a game where you're just like doing a snuff film and you're going around and just like killing people. It's some retarded game. It sucks, okay? There's nothing good about it at all. It's just net negative on every level, right? But the simple thing is, horror games in general, and this could include your shooters, your fighting games, like Doom 3, Dead Space, or your more those are your more action-y horror games, and then there's your non-action-y horror games, your horror survival games like Amnesia and Outlast and so on and so forth. Then there's hybrid like Fear. I really like Fear 1, actually. That's one of my favorite games of all time, right? The other part of horror games is that the game mechanics pretty much require story integration, right? Games that aren't story-centric are just pretty much multiplayer games. If the point of a game is for you to go through all these areas and experience all these horrors and fears and scares and stuff that they are setting up for you, the character has to have a reason to do that. And because you have to have a reason to do that, all of a sudden the developers and the writers, they need to think about, okay, well, what drives the character? What makes sense to the story? What are you trying to find out? It can't just be a simple case of you're going from point A to point B and getting scared, because you'll get bored. The game mechanics themselves require some sort of story integration as well. Like maybe you learn something about the world. Maybe you learn something about what's going on. A lot of horror games are actually about mystery. They're about mystery more than they are about horror. And part of the game is figuring out what the mystery is and uncovering it and reading notes and stuff as you go along and trying to learn what's actually going on. And it's usually really cool. And this goes for basically every horror game I can think of in like recent memory. This worked for the Silent Hill games, Amnesia, Outlast, everything, and they all have this mechanic integrated in because obviously they do, because there's nothing else to do, right? Even if it's not like, this is especially the case if it's not a shooting game like Doom or Dead Space, because then, I mean, if it's not a shooting game, then if it's a survival horror game, then it's a game where the player literally can't fight back. So the only game mechanic left is to give the player puzzles, which are interesting in and of themselves because they require to use your brain and actually do stuff, or it's to give the player a story, right? So that they get invested. It's to give the player a story so there's actually something there, something behind the whole thing, and not just cheap scares. And it's like that these games aren't cheap anymore. It's like that these games are actually cool and fascinating because they're so intricate. Okay, they are actually developed. People try to develop them, and the very act of making it intricate pulls it out of this disgusting squick genre where nothing is intricate, where it's just cheap and black and terrible and horrible and disgusting, right? Yeah. That's the simple reason. Another thing is games don't have to be stupid, right? Like horror movies. Horror movies have to be stupid. They either have to include stupid characters or stupid plot premises, or something needs to happen for someone to fail. In horror games, nobody has to fail, actually. It can be scary without failure, which is one of the great things. So because of that, you're allowed the opportunity to integrate so much intelligent game design into it. Again, like I said, you could have puzzles. Puzzles are interesting. Puzzles require using your brain. They can have an intricate story and mystery that you have to wrap up, that you have to figure out. And this is, and usually the mystery thing is delivered through like notes or emails or papers that you gather as you go through levels and read to learn more about what's going on, which is actually, it's usually what they do, because the main mechanic in a horror game is you're going through like a maze or an area, and you're getting scared as you go. So the only way to tie that into what's going on is to give the player little bits of information each time he goes through, right? Which by its very nature is intelligent, because if you're going to give the player information, there has to be information to give, which means there has to be a plot and a story and idea. Now granted, this isn't always done well, and in fact it's probably gotten to the point of gimmick at this point, but it's still pretty interesting. You know, if you look at the Silent Hill games that basically started this whole thing, the Silent Hill games aren't even scary in a classic sense. The Silent Hill games are like 100% psychological, right? They're not even about like jump scares or squick to a point. Outlast was kind of about squick. In fact, Outlast had a lot of squick if you think about it, but Outlast still had a really cool story, and it even had like a thematic layer to it that justified the story, which was really cool as well. I should actually review Outlast. Then there's Amnesia, which is like the staple of the genre itself, you know, the quintessential horror game, if you will. And Amnesia was all about survival, all about story and character development, both of the villain and yourself, right? And then there's what's it called? Amnesia Machine for Pigs, which I haven't played, but I've watched Let's Plays, which tried to do a lot of the same things. So I mean, it basically comes down to the point where you basically have to be incredibly creative to make a horror game. You don't have to be creative to make a horror movie. A horror movie, you can just follow a gimmick. A horror game, you have to be creative. Okay? Even if you're not creative with your level design, even if you're not creative with your puzzles, you have to be creative with your story or something, or you have to tie in all these elements. There's simply more complexity in the genre because there's all these things that need to be thought about. You have to think about story, you have to think about the gameplay elements, which would include puzzles and stuff. You have to think about the scares, which are, and the scares involve, you know, lighting design and level design and how jump scares work. They don't actually involve squick necessarily. So you have all of these elements come to light that don't involve the squicky, unappealing, disgusting part, right? That stuff is usually, or sometimes still there, because that kind of sets the mood and the tone, but I would say it justifies itself in some cases with some horror games because they have sufficient complexity in other areas that the entire game is still a net positive, even though it had this negative element to it. Even though this negative element isn't even negative in that case, because it's wrapped around it's wrapped around this with layer and layer and layer of intricacy and quality and good design. Okay, and that's all that thought put into the thing makes it more than just about feeling depressed and scared and unappealing. It makes it, an experience. The way I see it, that horror games are actually they're actually some of the most interesting games in general. Horror games can be more abstract than other games, right? They don't have to conform to the same rules, to be honest. They can do a lot of stuff different, right? Like the survival horror genre is completely different from most gaming genres. They don't even have to have enemies in some cases. One thing I thought about, which would be very cool, is a game that doesn't even have enemies, but it's still a scary game, right? Because you don't need to have enemies necessarily to make it scary. You can make it scary through atmosphere. You can make it scary through visual effects that make you think that there's enemies even though there isn't, right? Which would be very interesting. That a game like that, if done properly, would win award upon award upon award, because it would be amazing. Because people would be absolutely amazed by this game, even though the reality of it is it has no failure state. Now, maybe by your definition that wouldn't even count as a game, because maybe a game needs a failure state, but that's another argument. My point is, there's so much creativity involved in making a game. There's so much abstract creativity involved in making a game. There simply isn't the same in film. It's just not there. I'm not saying it's not possible. It is. I'm just saying it's not there today. It's not there in the industry. And it probably won't be like that for a while. And to be honest, it's not even... I will say that this is definitely a quality of the genre in general, okay? Of the genre and the medium. Of the genre coupled with the medium, okay? The fact that it's a game forces it to be complex, even though it doesn't have to be, even though it may not want to be. It forces complexity onto the thing. A horror movie, because there's no player integration or gameplay or investment, and none of that stuff is there, none of those elements even appear in a film, right? A film is all just what you see on the screen. That's literally all it is. Then this reduces the genre to the point where making it scary without making it squicky, making it scary without having to resort to violence and other cheap tricks, becomes really, really hard. It becomes a lot harder than in horror games. Making a horror game that's incredibly cool and abstract and creative is, in a sense, easier than making a horror movie, because movies, it's just harder to do. Movies just aren't like games, right? You just can't do the same thing. In a film, you would have to... You're basically allowed just story stuff and visual stuff, but you can't construct an entire... You can't construct an entire plot, you can't do the same stuff. I'm just saying. The plot has to be simplified, right? Because you can't leave little notes of paper and emails for players to find and learn more about the world. No, it has to be simplified. The characters have to be simplified. Automatically you're less invested in it because it's a movie, right? And at the end of the day, it's just supposed to scare you, so why not just make it cheap? Honestly, I feel like the horror genre, ideally, doesn't even belong in a horror movie. Ideally, I think the idea of horror as a genre, as an emotional thing, if the point of the film is to scare, then that doesn't belong in that film. It belongs in another film. It belongs in a film whose point it is to do a lot of stuff. Like Lord of the Rings, that had a lot of themes and a lot of layers to it. A movie that has a lot of layers to it can actually have a layer that's devoted to just scaring the audience. It can do that, and it can do that really well. Movies, and if because movies, these would be movies that are sufficiently complex that everything they have is interesting, and there's a layer of fear on top of that. But movies whose purpose it is to simply scare and do nothing else, where fear is the one layer, then all the other layers just get stripped away. If we start stripping away other layers, we we risk falling into that abysmal category of squick, right? If we do that, we fall into that category, and we don't want to do that. And for that reason, to make effective horror, to make real quality horror, one would have to not make horror, so to speak. One would have to make a movie that's complex in other ways and add horror on top. Horror cannot be the thing you construct the film around. Or maybe it could. Maybe it could, but then you'd have to be you'd have to be a genius, pretty much, to construct a film about, to construct everything in a movie around horror, but make all that other stuff sufficiently complex that it's not squick. You know, I can't imagine doing it. Like, I actually can't imagine. I can imagine a fascinating horror game without any squick. I can't imagine a movie. So, go figure for that one. But I really do wish it could be done, right? I mean, you'd have to do something like... It would be a very bizarre movie. It would be like a really weird abstract movie, like A Tree of Life or something. But it would be devoted to scaring you instead, right? And to not use squick, you would have to you'd have to use really weird visual things. It might kind of be like a Rob Zombie movie. You know, it would be scary because of all these weird visual effects, but without actually going into squick. I mean, you would just have to do some crazy CGI stuff, I guess. That's the only thing I can think of off the top of my head. Other than that, I would say horror genre in film belongs in films that aren't about horror. Because those are the films that can pull off horror properly without sinking into the staple, without sinking into the stereotype of low-quality, cheap thrills. Anyway, that's my opinion on that. Let me know if you enjoyed. Cheers.